So you want to know, did Jesus teach the rapture? To answer that, we need to understand how Matthew 24 fits with the previous chapter, and then also the questions he's trying to answer in that context. By the end of it, we'll have it all sorted out. Let's dive in. Matthew 24 picks up exactly where we left off in Matthew 23. Jesus has concluded his interaction with the Pharisees there, pronouncing the woes upon them. He has pronounced that Jerusalem will no longer be spared. He's unable to gather them to him, though he wanted to desperately. And now he's leaving the temple. And his disciples in the first verse decide to point out the buildings that are around him that are associated with the temple. Jesus takes a dark turn. He says, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you that not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." Now, very quickly, this is your first insight from Matthew 24. I want you to stop and think about what Jesus is connecting this to. Before we get into the rapture, we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but this directly affects how we should read Matthew 24. The apostles are basically showing Jesus, this is the temple. Of course, Jesus knew that. And what Jesus is telling them in essence here, and this is something Peter's going to echo in 1 Peter chapter 2, that Paul is going to echo in his epistles, that this temple is not where God is worshiped. In fact, this temple is going to be torn down. He's not talking about his body the same way he was in John 2 when he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it. He's talking about the literal buildings of the temple. And this is a reflection of the 118th Psalm, where we talked about the stone that the builders rejected a few days ago and how Jesus used that prophecy. In fact, I would make a note and I would journal this either in the margins of my Bible or in your journaling Bibles if you pick those up. I would make a note here that says 118th Psalm, 1 Peter chapter 2, just so you have a frame of reference for why Jesus is saying this. Now, the disciples find this troubling. And as they're journeying to the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen?" What things? This is the second piece of insight. This is the one that's going to move us through most of the chapter. Jesus had just told them the temple was going to be torn down. We need to keep that in our minds. The second question they ask, what will the sign of your coming be? So this is the idea of the parousia, which is a Greek term. It's found all over the New Testament. Make this insight number 2A if you're doing the Daily Bible Insights in your margins or your journaling Bibles. But the parousia, the return of Jesus, they're asking, what is the sign of your return? And then, what is the sign of the end of the age? Now, we very often want to associate that term age with the end of the world. But the question that they seem to be asking is, what are the signs of what he's talking about? That the apostles are conflating those three things as being the same thing. What I'm going to show you today is that Jesus seems to separate them out as if they're three different things. Now, something I want you to see here that I've got done in the Bible on the screen is I have a color code for this. I have things associated with answering the question of time. When will these things happen? The destruction of the temple. I have those underlined in blue in the chapter. You may disagree with where I put these things. And if so, I would love for you to let me know in the notes, because this is a discussion we've had many times on this channel, both on the podcast and in other long form episodes that I've done. I would love to invite any discussion, even if you disagree with me. I'd love to hear from you. But look at where he goes with this. So we have the time question underlined in blue. We have the signs of Jesus's return underlined in red. And then we have the questions about the end of the age, which that's not defined yet. We're going to let Jesus define that. We're going to underline those, not highlight them, mark through them, because some things are marked through that I just think are important verses to be able to see. But we're going to underline them in yellow. So Jesus is going to answer over the rest of Matthew 24 those three questions. And I want you to remember there are three separate questions that he's answering. And so Jesus said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you." Immediately, and I would make this point 2B. The parousia is 2A or maybe 2C, because the separate questions would be 2B. The Daily Bible Insight 2C for Matthew 24. See to it that no one misleads you. So many people are going to mislead you about these things. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. So Jesus is going to answer the question, should these things be tied to one another, or should they be separate from one another? Verse 6, of course, we have the saying, you will be hearing wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. Here's an end of the age statement. That is not yet the end. So that's not the end of the age. Now, we still don't know what the end of the age means. Is he talking about the destruction of the temple or the return, the parousia, the return of Christ? He then says, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. In various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Birth pangs for what? I'm going to submit to you, because the last thing that he said was the end of the age, that the birth pangs there should probably be associated with that. It's still not yet defined in the text. Then we get into a time statement. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And at that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Okay. Remember, there were signs, but the only question the apostles asked about time was, when will these things happen? What things? The tearing down of the temple, the destruction of the temple. He says it's going to happen at a time when there is tribulation. People are going to be killing you, that you're going to be hated by the nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. So he's answering the time question. It's going to come at a time when you're not popular. The Gentiles are going to hate you. The Jews are going to hate you. They're going to hate you for my name's sake. Many are going to fall away. Brother's going to betray brother and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, I marked this because he's still talking about the time that this is going to happen, but he's talking also about the end of the age. I marked it with a blue underline and a yellow highlight. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. I missed a highlight there. Verse 14, I'm going to add a yellow highlight because this is talking about both. He's talking about the end coming. The gospel will have been preached to all the nations. The whole world is a testimony to all the nations. So it's got to go to the Jews and the Gentiles before the end of the age. Is that talking about the end of time or the destruction of the temple? We still don't know, but I want you to see what happens. The one who endures to the end will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So we have signs of the end, and we have the timing of what he's talking about. So he seems to be answering the time question associated with the destruction of the temple. So therefore, we're starting to get an inkling here that the end of the age has something to do with the destruction of the temple. Now he's going to begin to talk about, and this one, we're going to go back to 2. Remember how we did the slow simmer the other day? We're going to go back to 2, but this one really needs to be its own insight. So we're going to talk about this abomination of desolation, which comes out of Daniel chapter 9. And Daniel chapter 9 is the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And there's all sorts of interpretations of the 70 weeks, from the time of Daniel to the destruction of the temple. There's a way of calculating that some people want to put it later in history, even present day history. But let's look at what's actually said about the abomination of desolation. And it says, this is in the middle of the 70 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off after 62 weeks in verse 26 and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood, even unto the end. There will be a war, desolations are determined, and he will make a firm covenant with the many. The many there seem to be people in the city because of what he's going to say next. And he will make a covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations, will come one who makes desolate even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. The one who's going to destroy the city. And again, this whole idea of the 70 weeks was because of the troubling vision that Daniel had. Daniel had been praying about understanding this vision, but he had this troubling vision. And basically, what he's told is the Messiah is going to come, but then the city is going to be destroyed. And then the destroyer is going to get destroyed later because God has a judgment for him. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Now, there's some indication that there had already been an abomination of desolation, which would have been back during the Maccabean revolt. But then it says, this is going to help us understand, is he talking about the end of the world or the end of the age? Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in the house. And whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant, to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation, such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. So what Jesus is saying is, look, you need to be praying that this isn't on the Sabbath or a whole bunch of people are going to get killed. Don't go back into the city. Just run to the mountains. Interesting about that is I think that answers the question of what the end of the age is. Don't go back to the city if the interpretation is there's supposed to be a new Jerusalem that descends from heaven. Going to the city is what we should do. But he says, don't go back. This is happening as part of a tribulation. So that answers pre-tribulation or post-tribulation rapture right there. He hasn't even talked about a rapture and says the greatest tribulation there will ever be is coming, and the only thing that you can do is run away from it. And then unless those days be cut short, no life would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. The elect would be the Christians. Now, Rome didn't distinguish between Jews and Christians. They weren't going to for a long time after this. They saw Christians as a weird sect of Judaism. And what he's ultimately saying here is the reason why God's not going to allow that to unfold in the worst possible way that it could is because the elect could get caught up in that. Now you see I've got some things marked in red. So now we're up to 2D. But you see I've got some things marked in red. And we said that the red here, going back to the original questions, just put them on your screen real quick, will be the sign of the coming of the Son of Man. So let's look at what I've got underlined here. Now, he's talking about events associated with the end of the age. They have a timeline associated with them that have to do with the destruction of Jerusalem from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and the 70 weeks of the Messiah. And that's where the Great Tribulation. Then, if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Jesus is saying, you're asking about the sign of my coming. Around the destruction of the temple, there's going to be some false Christs that are going to pop up. That's not me. Don't be deceived by them. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. What Jesus is saying is there is not going to be a secret at my coming. The rumor will be that Jesus is secretly out in the wilderness, or Jesus came back in secret. You've heard the term secret rapture before, where people are just disappeared out of the world and Jesus never appeared. Jesus is saying my parousia, my coming, is not going to be like that. I'm not going to be hidden in an inner room somewhere. It's going to be like lightning. You're going to know that it happens. So then we have this statement, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. The more accurate translation there, because it's the same word, is probably eagles, which was the sign of the Roman army. And is this a sign of the coming of Jesus? Jesus has just said, all of these things are not signs of my coming. My coming is going to be like lightning. It flashes from the east to the west. It's going to be quick, but nobody's going to deny it. But what the sign of this end of the age is going to be is there's going to be a lot of dead people associated with vultures or eagles. Then you get to verse 29, and I would make this in verse 29, we're still tracking that second insight, but this is going to be insight number 4. You have an interesting word at the beginning of verse 29. It is the word immediately. That is the Greek word outheos, which doesn't always indicate time. And that's the problem we have with it, is that it usually indicates one event flowing into the other. That it's like saying, I put my check in the bank and my account went up by $800. There's not a step between, not that I have a check for $800. I'm just using that as an example, but it's like saying there's not a step between them, that one thing leads to another, that there's not a point of prophecy that needs to be fulfilled. Now, if you interpret that as instantaneously, that after this, in a very short time, this needs to happen, it can mean that, but it doesn't exclusively mean that. And I think that exclusivity is where we run into problems with the idea of immediately there. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall. Now, I'm going to call this part of 4 because I'm not ready to get to 5 yet. But here we have this quotation, and it shows up in Isaiah 13 and 10. It is the same imagery used in Isaiah 24, which is when God was judging the whole earth and he was destroying nations in Isaiah 24, verse 23. We see it in Ezekiel 32 and 7. That's a lament over the destruction of Egypt. And then we also see it in Joel chapter 2, which incidentally is a passage that Peter is quoting from in Acts 2, where God is promising deliverance after judgment. The sky being darkened and the moon not giving its light and stars falling, that is judgment language. It is apocalyptic language. It is used figuratively throughout the Old Testament. And that is really important when we start seeing those same words used over in the New Testament. The reason why a lot of people like to take Old Testament and say, here's a bunch of prophecy about the end of the world, is because if you don't say, hey, he's talking about Pharaoh here, or hey, he's talking about judging the whole world as he is setting up the world under one nation in Isaiah 24 and using that same language, if you don't fast forward it all the way to the end of the world, you have to admit that that language gets used figuratively quite a lot in the Bible. So a lot of people don't like that. But I would challenge you, look at those references, go back and check them out. Again, you disagree with me, I'd love to talk about it in the comments. If you feel up to it, Brian and I would even love to have you on the program to maybe debate it on a podcast. I would be more than willing to consider that. Just, you guys know how to contact me. It's right there. Just do it. Look at where it goes from here. And the powers of heaven will be shaken. That term gets used in I'm going to make this one 4B because I'm running out of steps to get to 5, but I just thought about this. I'm going to make this one 4B. It's a very similar statement to what the Apostle Paul talks about with spiritual warfare over in Ephesians chapter 6. But looking at verse 30 now, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So now he's answering their third question. What's the sign of the Son of Man? It's going to happen after desolation. It's going to happen after tribulation. But when it comes, it's not going to be like the destruction of the temple where they're telling you Jesus is hiding in the wilderness or Jesus is hiding in an inner room. He says, I'm going to come on the clouds. Now, what's interesting is Paul talks about this in 1 Thessalonians. It very much resembles what he also talks about concerning the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. So you've got the 1 Thessalonians 4 reference here. You've got the 1 Corinthians 15 reference here. But Jesus is saying, here's the sign of my return. Now, verse 32 is an interesting transition. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So he's answering a time question here. We've got to ask ourselves, what is he talking about? Was that generation not going to pass away before Jesus returned? Jesus says his return is going to be like lightning. You're not going to miss it. He's going to come on the clouds. Or is he answering the time question that they asked in verse 3? When are these things going to happen? Before this generation passes away, these things are going to take place. And he's tied that now to the end of the age. So basically, what he seems to be saying is within your lifespan, within your reasonable lifespan, you're going to see the temple destroyed. And that's the answer to your time question. And the reason why I say it's only the answer to one is because of what he says in verse 36. Verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So this thing is absolutely certain. It's the word of God. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Verse 36, Jesus is obviously talking about something different than he was in verse 33 or 34. In 34, he says, you can watch for the signs. In 32, you can know I'm at the door. You can know that this generation is not going to pass away until all these things take place. Verse 36, of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. He's talking about two different periods of time. The first one they had asked about. The second one, the only thing that's out there that he could still be talking about is the coming of the Son of Man. If the end of the age is represented by the destruction of the temple, and it coincided with the gospel going to the Jews and the Greeks, and it coincided with their generation, this other day, I can't tell you when that's going to happen. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Here's where the rapture thinking comes in. And this is where we want to slow down, want to think about what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about signs and times. First of all, he says, you can't know the time. It's going to be like the days of Noah. You can't know the time because the angels in heaven don't know it. I don't know it. Remember, he's in full submission to the Father, God, but he's in a man body and he's learning obedience. And this is something the Father has not given him access to when he's in that state. He says it's going to be just like the days of Noah. What does he mean by that? For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. It comes without warning. We're always hearing about wars and rumors of wars and those being birth pangs, earthquakes, and all those things. Those are always biblical judgments, but they don't seem to be associated with the coming of the Son of Man. They seem to be associated with the destruction of the temple, the end of that age. Here he's saying there is no sign, there is no warning. It's just going to come. Noah preached for 100 years while he was building the ark and nobody believed him, but it's just going to come. Now, here's what's interesting about this. Here's your fifth insight. Are you ready? Look at what he says right here. Taking this, what he says in verse 39, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then there will be two men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. If Jesus is teaching a Hal Lindsey-like rapture, late great earth rapture theology, then there's an issue with the way that we understand it. Because he said it's going to be, and I'll put it back on the screen, he said it's going to be like the days of Noah. Those who are taken are those who are not prepared to enter the ark. In Jesus's depiction, if he's depicting a rapture-like event, as opposed to the resurrection to eternal life or to destruction that he talks about in John chapter 5, if he's talking about a rapture-like event, then what he just said is it's better to be left behind than to be taken. That's a big problem for the rapture. It's better at the parousia of Christ, if he's going to return and do this secret rapture, it's better to be left behind. according to what Jesus just said. The other alternative is that's not what he's talking about. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming, but be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have been on alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. For this reason, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. So no preludes, no wars, no rumors of wars, no third temples, no red heifers. None of the things that are making the rounds in the news are part of Matthew 24. I'm not going to read this parable that comes next because it's really a prelude to Matthew 25. A master leaves his steward in charge of his house. The steward can do one of two things. He can either spend his life living as if that could be the day the master would return and he'll be pleased with him, or he can take advantage of the liberty that his master has given to him, and the master will throw him out into the place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's just meant to emphasize that we need to live in readiness. And it also parallels the parable of the talents in the next chapter, which incidentally, we're going to talk about tomorrow. So I leave it up to you. Is the rapture part of Matthew 24? We're going to talk a lot more about this, but until we do, I want you to watch this video right over here that we've done on this topic already. And until I talk to you tomorrow, have a good day and God bless.